the question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr Speaker.
Andrew Little.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, Mr Speaker, you can tell just how serious this minister is in getting this piece of legislation through, because he's relying on the crack team of Craig Foss to have to usher him along to get the bill through. This is how vital and essential this piece of legislation is. The reality is that the minister, he cannot bring himself, even now, 10 days out from the expiry of the special housing area legislation and having to rush through this piece of legislation, he still cannot bring himself to admit what every New Zealander knows, and that is that we have a housing crisis. We have a housing crisis. And just cobbling together at the last minute, because he suddenly realised the dream of special housing areas is about to fly out the window with so few special houses built. He's got to do something about it. Now, I don't know how he persuaded his cabinet colleagues to take the time of the House to pass this through urgency when he has known, when he will have known, when he did know that the legislation that we're now amending was coming up for an expiry only 10 days away. Only 10 days away. And so, Mr Speaker, this urgency in this House for this piece of legislation is an expression of the complete and utter shambles that housing policy is in under this minister and this government. That's what this is about. This House is taking its valuable time at this important time of the year to sweep up after this minister yet again because of the total shambles that his policy is in. Because like every effort he has made, like every policy he has introduced on housing, has completely turned to custard. Now, Mr Speaker, you look at the special housing areas and you look at the number now that are being offered for sale on Trade Me for land banking. They get the special housing areas, and yet the developers, some developers, have no intention whatsoever of fulfilling the criteria and actually getting houses built. And the whole condition of getting expedited consenting processes was that these developers with the special status would actually get houses built. But that's not happening in far too many cases. Now, it is true that the minister says, you know, there's a handful of them, they've got their applications lodged, we've just got to bring it on a bit. I mean, this is with 10 days to go before the expiry of this legislation. There are far too few houses being built on special housing areas, and that's the problem. They've gone to land bankers. The reality is we have a chronic shortage of housing in Auckland and other parts of New Zealand, and this minister and his government has failed to deliver for the thousands of New Zealanders struggling to get their first home. And let's not be sort of, mollycoddled by the figures that the government, both the minister and the Prime Minister, have been trotting out. Let's be very clear that the 9,651 houses consented in the last 12 months is below the 12,000, nearly 13,000 consented in 2004. In 2004. And that was at a time when Auckland's population was much, much smaller. So on a kind of per capita basis, the building program right now is way behind, absolutely way behind. And if you have a look at what Statistics New Zealand says and their analysis of the number per 1,000 people, now sure, it has risen to 6.3 in the last 12 months from the low of 3.1 in 2011. But that is still only half what it was in 1974. That's the real measure, number of houses per 1,000 people. And this government is way behind. It is a comparative issue, and it is about New Zealand's prospects, about getting into a house. And it's no longer just any house, because plenty of builders are building the big, expensive McMansion kind of $1 million average houses, plenty of those. It's that those on modest incomes, working hard, sometimes more than one job, couples more than several jobs between them, saving hard, working hard, chasing that Kiwi dream, but they can't get it. They can't get it because this government doesn't care about affordable housing. This government doesn't care about affordable housing. This legislation will help five out of 154 special housing areas. Now we know of those other, the 149, we know that there are plenty that are just being land banked. That's all they are. There is no serious program. There is no serious program to accelerate affordable house building under this government in New Zealand today. Now, Mr. Speaker, we could support this first part of this legislation because at this stage, anything, the smallest thing, the smallest scare at anything that will help get one extra affordable house, I have to say we have to support it. We would have to support that. But, Mr. Speaker, that doesn't explain or justify why the Minister has included these other provisions on the offer-back provisions under the Public Works Act. That is completely unrelated to anything to do with special housing areas and getting more affordable housing being built. It isn't needed. They are not needed to achieve the objectives that he has of using special housing areas to get houses built. It simply is not needed. And that assumes that, of course, even if these other special housing area applications are approved by the Council after this legislation passes, that it will lead to more affordable housing very quickly. Even assuming that, the Public Works Act provisions are not needed. The reality is, and I want to hear from David Seymour from the ACT Party about this, because I think the good burghers of Epsom will be very interested to know what is happening, potentially happening to their property rights. Those who lounge back in the leafy streets of Epsom and Parnell, wondering how their investment properties are going, they'll be wanting to know whether or not any property they own or they've have an interest in that has been or had an interest in that has been purchased on the Public Works Act, they're going to get a right to get back. Because under these amendments, they won't. Their rights will be traduced. Private property rights will be traduced in these provisions. It's not standard practice for the Labor Party to champion the cause of private property owners, but in the absence of the government, and so far in the absence of the ACT Party, we have to. We have to, because nobody else is. And we ought to take that sort of measure very seriously. This House should not be passing legislation that traduces those rights quickly or inadvisedly or expeditiously just because we have a minister who has performed so woefully in his portfolio that we're down to desperate measures. Mr. Speaker, the reality is this. New Zealand needs a genuine, comprehensive housing plan to fix the housing crisis. We need a housing policy and a housing package that is going to get more houses built, including, if necessary, in Clutha Southland, but certainly in the many other areas around New Zealand, Auckland, Hamilton, Tauranga, Taupo, as I discovered the other day, even up the Kapiti Coast and parts of Wellington, and Nelson, and Queenstown. New Zealanders are looking for an answer, looking for leadership on the issue of housing, genuinely affordable housing, so that those on modest incomes, those on reasonable incomes, who work hard and save hard and do the best they can, but no matter how hard they try, cannot get their foot on that bottom rung of the housing and home ownership ladder. That's who we should be concerned about. And this piece of legislation, the first part, adds a mere skerrick, a mere iota of difference to that objective, but that is all. But the other part, the second part, the offer-back provisions, will not help one bit. And we are opposed to those, Mr. Speaker. And so we cannot support this legislation in its current form. And there remains a possibility, I hope, that during the passage in this House under urgency, the Minister might come to his senses, his colleagues might come to their senses, David Seymour might come to his senses and say, you know what, we all agree there is a housing crisis, we know something has to be done, we do need those special housing area provisions, small contribution as they will make to the housing crisis, but we do not need to traduce private property rights and create a constitutional crisis that we just don't need. If that happens, Mr. Speaker, we could support the legislation, but not in its current form, cobbled together in a hurry because this minister is so desperate to prove once again that, he doesn't have to get absolutely everything wrong. Well, he's on a hiding to nothing on that already, so let's just be honest about it. Let's just be honest about it. This legislation If it confines itself to the special housing area issues alone, we can support. In its current form, we cannot, because it takes unnecessary steps that will add nothing at all to additional housing affordability. And while that is there, this legislation cannot be supported and will not be supported. And I simply urge the Minister, Mr. Speaker, I urge the Minister, look carefully, listen carefully. If we want to do the right thing for New Zealand and the housing crisis, it will not be in this bill in its current form.
Alfred Ngaro.